Welcome back to Copper Star Precision, the channel dedicated to getting you more points at your competitive shooting matches. Now, I know it's been a while since my last CZ MTR update, but we're back. I had to refilm a bunch of segments because I wasn't happy with the quality of how things came out, and I want to make sure I'm putting out the best quality for you. So if you have a CZ 457 and you want to learn all about the trigger, that's what today's episode is about. We're going to talk about the YoDave trigger spring kit. We're going to talk about using a ballpoint pen spring to lower the trigger weight, and as well as talk about how to adjust the trigger for how crisp you can get it, the minimum amount of pre-travel, the minimum amount of over-travel in the trigger. We're going to be going over all of that. A little bit longer video, but I'm taking you step by step through all the processes. But talking about triggers gets YouTube triggered. So this video is definitely going to be like age restricted, demonetized, all of that kind of stuff. Even though it's fully within YouTube guidelines, they're still going to flag it. I guarantee it. We're not making a hair trigger here. We are simply making factory adjustments to the factory trigger to set it up for competition. It has nothing to do with making the rifle unsafe. It's a bolt gun, so we're not going to be able to change it to full auto or full semi-auto, as some of the politicians say. But more importantly than ever, please go down, like this video, share it with your friends who have CZs if they've ever been curious about making these adjustments. This is how I do it. And definitely while you're down there, don't forget to comment and subscribe to this channel, because this video will be suppressed, I guarantee it, because working on guns in a safe environment is taboo on YouTube. But without further ado, let's talk about the trigger on the CZ457. So as I mentioned, I'm refilming this, so hopefully this is a better view, not as dark as the other video, but consequently I already have the YoDave trigger spring kit installed in this MTR trigger, and I have it set to where I want it, so I don't really want to take this apart. So instead I thought we'd try this other CZ trigger. This is another stock trigger. The only difference between the MTR trigger and this trigger, they're exactly the same, except this one has a chromed trigger shoe. So this is off of CZ457 American, and we're going to try to see if we can find maybe a pen spring that will work in its place. But first, what we have to do is get the trigger. It's going to be easier to take out the trigger spring with the trigger actually on the action itself. And this also goes out to a viewer, John, who sent me a nice email, and he's having trouble getting this back together. All right, so we're trying to get these three pieces back together, and this is kind of a pain in the butt. So this part, this spring here, has like a loop towards it. Make sure that is facing forward. So the loop has to face forward, and make sure these fins are kind of spread out, face forward, and then we stick this on top here, and we're going to try and get all these holes lined up. And using a finger inside the action, we're going to try and push this into the action while pinching from the top to get everything lined up. And now I'm just looking to see, hopefully all those holes are lined up. And then we need to slide this pin in from the top. Just going to keep wiggling this back and forth until we're all the way through like that. It's a really pain in the butt, but then when you have it in here, it's not too bad. As you can see, the hinge is in there, and then when you close this, everything's going to line up nicely. So while we have it here, before we do anything else, we're going to put the crush washer and the bolt back in here. And this is a T25, so I'm just rotating counterclockwise until I feel the bolt catch. And we're not going to tighten this up all the way yet. And then last part we have to do is put this little C-clip back in position on the opposite side. Careful not to lose this, it's very tiny. Sometimes it helps to have screwdriver or something. Guide it in here. like so, and then we're just going to push it on until it snaps, and I like to rotate it like that, right in there. So now we can go back. As far as torque values, I have no idea. Let's just call it 25 inch-pounds on this screw here, or just use the German Gudentight. There's a crush washer on here. 25 inch-pounds feels pretty good, maybe a little more. It's a crush washer in here. This shouldn't back out, but now we have the trigger installed. Okay, so now with that out of the way, kind of annoying. The YoDave trigger spring kit comes with this little Delrin block, which has a hole in it. Usually the spring is inside here in the packaging, but like I said, it's already been installed on this other trigger that I have. But for sake of example, this Delrin block goes underneath, and we need to drive out this staked pin. And what I will do is I will probably mark which side I'm going to drive through. Just make a mark, or just remember that it's the right side. And then we're just gonna put this pin on here, and we're gonna line everything up, and then we are going to need a punch. This is a 1/8 inch punch, and we simply need to punch this out. So give it a couple taps, and then we're going to make sure that it lines up with the hole in the Delrin block so that we can punch straight through. So just make sure we're lined up on that hole, like so. And we're going to punch this the rest of the way out. All right, so now that we've punched out the pin here, it is captured within the Delrin block. There's our pin. We're going to put that in a safe spot. And the trigger itself kind of slides to the rear and comes straight down. And this is our trigger spring, what we are going to replace. It just sits in here, maybe with a little bit of grease. So let's take some measurements of this spring and see if we can find something that can approximate it. So the spring itself, uncompressed, is about 0.385 inches long. The outer diameter is about 0.147 inches, and if I can get a reading on the thickness of the coils themselves, which will be a little difficult to do, somewhere around 0.029, so maybe 30 thousandths of an inch. So like I said, I already have the YoDave spring installed in this other trigger, but I'm going to take apart a bunch of these pins and see if we can find something that is similar. So I will join you in a moment if I find something. Okay, so I found a spring that was somewhat similar. It was a little too thick, so what I did is I cut it a few coils long and then squeezed some of the end coils together using some pliers. So this, I squeezed that a little bit together so that it would fit inside the trigger itself. So there's a little recess here. Now luckily the recess on the actual trigger housing itself is wider and it does fit, but I just needed to just put a little bit in there to make sure that it would stay put. Now I'm not advocating doing this at all. You know, obviously we're going to test to make sure the trigger is safe. Just buy yourself the YoDave kit, but this is just for demonstration purposes. So you get your spring, and simply we're going to put it back. And the way you put it back is there's a recess in here that actually lines up with this adjustment screw on the outside. So this adjustment screw here is where this spring sits. So if you imagine, that's kind of the skeleton view, that spring has to be in line with that. So we're just gonna try and finagle this into where it's supposed to be. Now if you're having trouble and the screw keeps, or the spring keeps popping out as it often does,
You can try putting a little dab of grease on the trigger housing side. But let's see if we can get this in here. Yeah, it looks like we are in. And then all that's left to do is to put back that pin that we had. Let's see if that made any difference to the trigger pull weight. All right, so feels way lighter. Let's see if it actually did anything. Let's see if it's even safe. Okay, doesn't look like the firing pin has fallen. Yeah, that feels way lighter. Now, I'm not saying to do this. I'm saying to get the YoDave trigger spring kit, but let's just, for the fun of it, see. We were about 2.5 pounds before at the lightest setting. Let's see where we're at now. Right about 1 pound, 5.6 ounces. So 1 pound, 6 ounces. We can try that again. Let's see where we're at. £1 pound, 6.8 ounces. So down to about 1.5 pounds. A little less than 1.5 pounds. That's not bad. That was 1.32. So as you can tell, with using a spring from a pen, it was just a random Staples pen that I found, not giving super consistent results, obviously, because we modified that spring to fit and it's not the right application for that. But, you know, in a pinch, I wonder if this will break in after a couple of dry fires. Let's try it now. Yeah, pretty inconsistent. My YoDave spring, as advertised, did come in at about 50% of the pull weight, so I was able to get it down to about 1 pound, 3 ounces, 3 to 4 ounces from 2.5 pounds. So as advertised, halfway, but you know, you can, I guess, do it with a spring from a pen. Interesting. All right, so while we're here, let's talk about some of the adjustments you can make. There is actually a 7mm nut, which is kind of an odd size, but this nut, which I just took off right here, holds a set screw, which is 2mm, and this set screw goes against the spring that we just changed. So by turning this outwards, we are decreasing the pressure of this set screw on the spring. So turning it out will lower the trigger pull weight, turning it in will increase the trigger pull weight. So we've got that basically pretty far out, and then we can just get this back on there without cross-threading it. Like so, and then we can tighten this up. So we've got it set pretty low. Okay, then we have 2 other screws. So this screw underneath here is actually 1.5, and what this is going to do is change how far forward or back the trigger goes. So if we cock this and we start turning this screw, again, this screw down here, 1.5mm. If we start turning this slowly, I'm turning it counterclockwise. So counterclockwise pretty much all the way has brought it as far forward as it's going to go. Now if we turn it clockwise, remember, rifle is cocked, it's obviously unloaded. If we start screwing this in, what's going to happen is that it's actually pushing against this part of the trigger housing, and it's going to push the trigger back. However, it can push it so far back that it will actually trip the firing pin. So we're going to keep going and going slow until right there. So right there is the point at which the firing pin has tripped. Now if we try and recock the bolt, I get nothing. So it's not actually engaging. So from that point, we need to loosen. I like to loosen about 1/4 to 1/2 a turn. Let's go with a 1/2 a turn, and then see if the rifle actually cocks, which it did. Okay, so that has given me pretty much the minimum safe, basically pre-travel. So if you're looking at here, I mean, there's the ever so slightest take up. Okay, so that's like the minimum pre-travel that we can get. Now, if you notice, after it breaks, there's a little bit of over travel, and then we can adjust that with this front screw here. So let's cock the rifle again. And then we are going to turn this clockwise until it's about touching, come back 1/4 turn. Let's see what that has done. Okay, so now the trigger doesn't even fire. So with the rifle cocked, we're going to put a little bit of pressure on the trigger, and we're going to turn this outwards. A little bit of pressure on the trigger, turning this out right there until it fires. So that's going to give us essentially the minimum, and see how there's like very little play after the trigger fires, very little over travel. So by doing those 2 steps, we have basically gotten the quote-unquote crispest trigger that we can get out of the stock triggers. So what we've done is we've set a very light trigger weight. We have then pushed essentially the pre-travel screw so that we get as little pre-travel as possible without the gun being unsafe. And then we have adjusted the over travel screw so we get as minimum over travel as possible. So we just get that clean break, and there's very little movement in here. Okay, real quick update. Put the trigger with the YoDave trigger spring back in it, and following the same procedure as I outlined before, we are down to about 1 pound, 2 ounces with the YoDave trigger spring kit. So quite an improvement over the factory trigger. That one's actually down to 1 pound. So yeah, right around 1 pound is what I'm able to get with the YoDave trigger spring kit. So don't do something silly and use the spring out of pen. Just buy the kit. Again, comes with this Delrin block and the spring, and it's not too difficult to change out. Just take your time. If you're not comfortable doing it and you don't want to stay in base class or something where you need to use the factory trigger, obviously I'm a huge advocate for the Timney triggers, the drop-in trigger kits. My Timney trigger, my open gun, is down to 8 ounces, so definitely something to look into there. But if you're looking for a cheap way to get a lighter, more crisp trigger pull, YoDave trigger spring kit is the way to go.